Today's headline is A Strange Adventure, written by Alexander Hamilton. It says, "We lived, at the time when the strange incident occurred to me which I am about to relate, in a large pleasant house overlooking the lake on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. It had been raining all day, one of those disagreeable rains which are so common in the West during the spring months. But late in the afternoon, the weather partially cleared, and taking advantage of the hour before sunset, I donned hat and shawl and walked hastily down the avenue toward the house of my old school friend and crony, Laura Mason. I found Laura at home, and the time passed so quickly in running over those bits of news and gossip which dearest friends are wont to exchange who have been separated from each other for a day or two, that it was very nearly dark when I exclaimed, 'Dear me, Laura, Papa made me promise to be back before dark. What will he say if I stay any longer?' Laura tried to persuade me to wait until one of her brothers would be at hand to escort me home, but I laughed at her fears and started for home alone. I had scarcely walked half a dozen squares when I noticed a cab drive hastily by me and stop suddenly a few yards ahead. Scarcely had the horse come to a standstill when two figures darted out of the vehicle and approached me with heavy strides. I hurried on, but a detaining hand was laid on my shoulder, and turning with a start, I felt myself suddenly gagged and unable to scream, and too frightened to attempt resistance. The two men, tall muscular fellows with heavy black masks completely covering their faces, in less time than it takes to relate, lifted me into the cab, then jumped in after me. I felt myself driven rapidly off, I knew not whither. All the dreadful tales of murder and abduction which I had ever heard of or read about trooped through my dazed brain. The blinds of the cab were drawn, making it impossible to see into the streets through which we passed. The moments seemed like hours. On. Would we ever stop? Once or twice I tried to rise to my feet, thinking it might be possible to burst open the door and spring to the ground. I was held down with a grip of iron, while one of the men whispered, 'Be perfectly quiet or I'll kill you.' At last we stopped. One of the men opened the door and vanished from sight into the inky blackness of night, while the other hastily passed his arm around my waist and clasped my hands with a vice-like grasp. Unable either to speak or move, I could only pray harder than I ever had done before in my life. The masked captor who had left us presently returned with a lamp. I was hustled out of the cab and led up a narrow alley into what appeared to be a wood yard. We crossed this arena, went up 2 flights of steep steps and across a passageway, finally stopping before a door, which was unlocked, while the cloth which covered my face was removed, and I was thrust in, and the door locked and bolted again. I found myself in a large, brilliantly lighted, and handsomely furnished bedroom. Exhausted and wretched, I sank into an easy chair and tried to collect my thoughts. 1 hour succeeded another, and still I sat waiting, wondering, trying to think that I would be missed at home and rescued. But even as thoughts of rescue flitted across my mind, I knew how improbable was the chance of anyone having seen me enter the cab, and even had my captors been noticed, how impossible it must have been to anyone to keep trace of the cab in its long and crooked course. I heard no sound, saw no one. Finally, toward morning, worn-out nature asserted itself, and I sank into a deep sleep. When I awoke, it was broad day. The sun streamed in through the windows and played fitfully on the carpet. I watched it idly for a few seconds, as half-waking people are apt to do. Then suddenly noticing the strange room and my peculiar position in a chair, a remembrance of the terrible ordeal of the preceding night flashed across my mind, and I started up in alarm. I looked out of the window, but only saw an unfamiliar courtyard which furnished no clue to the part of the city my captors had carried me. Soon the sound of footsteps outside the door arrested my attention. The bolt was drawn back, the key turned in the latch, and the door opened. I saw a tall, gaunt woman of the middle class, seemingly about 50 years of age, dressed in shabby mourning, standing there. She carried in her hand a tray containing hot coffee, rolls, and fried chicken, which she set down upon the table with the words, "Eat this little bit of breakfast now and you'll feel better." I sprang toward her. "Tell me," I cried. "Why am I here? What will they do with me? Who?" She cut me short by saying, in a not unkindly voice, "I'm not able to help you or answer your questions. It may turn out all right." Presently she carried away, almost untasted, the tray containing the breakfast. Later in the day she brought me some dinner, and toward night a cup of tea. The long hours passed by, and still no assistance arrived. I tried to read. On the table were several fresh magazines, but I could not fix my thoughts on any subject long enough to interest myself, and I finally gave up to my gloomy meditations. It grew dark again at last, and perhaps it was about 8 o'clock when the sound of voices and heavy steps outside the door aroused me, and immediately afterward 2 men, my masked captors of the night before, entered the room and advanced toward me. They still wore masks. In the glare of the gaslight, I noticed that their clothes were new and of a fashionable cut, and their hands white and evidently unused to toil. My heart was in my mouth. I confronted them, resolved to defend myself to the last. They gazed at me attentively, and one of them exclaimed with a dreadful oath, "It is not the right one." They conversed together for a few moments in a low voice, and one of them presently said politely, "Please put on your hat and shawl and accompany us. It is all a mistake." I did so, and we three proceeded down the stairway, across the courtyard, and through the alley, again entering a cab, where I was treated less like a prisoner and with more ceremony than the night before. We drove rapidly along, and in a short time stopped at the identical spot where I had been seized. The driver opened the cab door and politely handed me out of the vehicle, which when it had landed me drove off again, the 2 masked men remaining inside. 10 minutes later, I was at home, and had scarcely stepped over the threshold of the door when I swooned away. I afterward learned that search had been made for me during those 24 hours when I was in captivity, and now no trace whatever of my whereabouts had been found. From that day to this, it has never been discovered who my masked captors were, and it will probably always remain a mystery. But this strange adventure, which is given almost word for word as it was related to the writer, really happened some years ago to a young lady in Chicago. This story comes from the great state of Georgia, being reported in the Weekly Sumter Republican of February 4th, 1876. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.